Well, happy Saturday. I'm very excited that we can have this conversation today. I'm Lindsay Ruiz. I am the founder at Human as Usual. It's a new venture I've been launching for a little bit now, and also somebody who has been trying to share some messages out here on LinkedIn to spread awareness, to recognize that there are conversations that we need to be having that are not necessarily the conversations we would have on a typical Saturday, but that are very important given the impact and the repercussions and the experiences a lot of people have in life and in the workplace. And I want to use my channel, my conduits to support these conversations. So welcome. I know some people will join live, some people may catch up with the recording. Nonetheless, today is about raising awareness about an issue that I care a lot about. You probably have seen some of my posts, some of the conversations I've had with people that I get to partner with and have very good collaborations with here on the platform. And one of those topics is narcissistic abuse. There's a lot going on when it comes to discussing toxic workplaces, toxic leadership, what is happening right in the environments that we are supposed to come in as a team that are needing to provide healthy conditions for us to thrive and for us to flourish as humans in our professions. And sometimes that is not the case. And there is a big conversation currently going on regarding that. So what I wanted to do today is contribute one piece of work that I have done personally as part of my academic journey that relates in some way to this awareness that we all need to have around what it means to deal with toxicity in the workplace, what is underneath the dynamics that sometimes we become targets of and get to sadly experience, in many cases affecting our careers, driving us out of the workplace, having us make very, very big decisions in life as to whether or not where we are is serving us in our professional journey. I took probably, 10 or 12 years to study narcissistic abuse out of a personal circumstance. Through my journey, I got the opportunity to also document my learnings in the form of a doctoral dissertation that legitimized a lot of my research and also put some words and some frameworks together to help us understand this phenomenon, because it happens. It's very normal. It's very common to find it in our workplaces. And I wanted to have something that I could then use to educate people and spread awareness and make sure that we could have some language and some common experiences regarding this conversation. So what I want to do today is maybe walk you through the findings of my research. Hopefully we will find some common touch points in that information that either make you reflect a little bit more about experiences you have been a part of, maybe give you some new information that could inform how to handle situations you might be dealing with. But if anything can bring us together in this conversation and raise this very, very important awareness today, especially June 1st, that it is World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day. So without further ado, I'm going to use some materials that I have. Maybe you're watching on your phone, so hopefully some of these materials come through in your small screens, but this will stay recorded. So if you want to catch up on your laptop later, you can do that as well. But I thought it would be more formal and more informative if I have you see and walk through the findings of my research in narcissistic abuse. So I call it Narcissism Isn't Leadership. And I want to start here because we have been sold this idea of what leadership looks like, We have been told that we have to be charismatic, that we have to be extroverted, that we have to win at all cost, that it doesn't matter, how we find means to an end. The game is to learn how to navigate the system, how to deal with politics. And through my experience, through my research, and now that I've been discussing this topic a little bit more directly in certain groups, I have found that to be a misleading framework. And I want to make sure that we're able to separate the idea of, dealing with a narcissistic environment, which could be a group of people, which could be a person themselves. It could be the culture of an organization or a community that you're a part of, and what leadership really is intending to do in the most, or in the healthiest form in which we come into these environments to lead others, impact others, create environments that others can also, come in and find fulfilling, and where we lift each other up and we move society and humanity forward. So they're two very different things. Narcissism is one thing, leadership is another thing. When I was starting in this journey of learning about these topics, this pathology, from a personal experience, I came across a quote that says, "The healing begins the day you discover there's a name for what you've been experiencing." A very, very, very common part of the situation when it comes to understanding narcissistic abuse, whether you are being affected by it and whether or not you are in an environment that is healthy for you, is this normal experience to feel as if you are the one who's crazy. We tend to question our intuition. We tend to question our experience. We tend to listen to what other people's experiences are and how those experiences that are coming from externally validate our own. And when it doesn't do that, then we take it upon ourselves to feel like we are the ones who are crazy and misconstruing and misunderstanding what is happening. However, when it comes to narcissistic abuse, when it comes to dealing with people who are literally predators of your spirit, of your well-being, you are not crazy. You are also not alone. And it's important that we start from this fact, because as we discover what you're dealing with, you will get to gain your power back into what are the things that I can do about this if it's happening to me. There are a number of quotes on this visual here. You may or may not be able to read them depending on the size of your screen. But this is a collection of actual testimonies of people who reported having been victims of narcissistic abuse, who contributed that to my research. They said things like, the narcissistic person, the abuser, would cozy up to the leader and the leader would love her. They would say things like, he was seen as the golden person by the then COO because he was bringing in the money. She's a senior leader at the company even today, and she continues to excel and move up. Another comment just to highlight here would say, HR would send messaging for people to feel comfortable denouncing and leaning on them to address workplace injustice. However, the culture did not allow for the due process to go without exposure. They also said defining success is an interesting concept. What is successful? Avoiding or running? I don't know that you are successful when it comes to these people, because they ultimately win, not by getting to you, but by chasing you away. So these are examples of things that real people told me when I interviewed them for my research. I think these are also examples of things that we have heard other people say in our regular common day when we are in our workplaces, in our family lives, where we feel there's an imbalance of power and there is an obvious way to chase the person who is receiving the abuse away from the circumstance when they become a threat to the person who is perpetrating the abuse. And the sad part of all of the testimonies that I received is that all of them coincide in this one sentence, which is the narcissist ultimately wins, which conveyed for me a sense of powerlessness and a sense of defeat and a sense of failure. Because people who ended up, let's say, saving themselves, who ended up choosing the healthy route, they chose that by giving up, by quitting the environments in which they were being mistreated and abused and taken advantage of. And instead of seeing that as a sign of power and health and taking back their lives, they saw that as a sense of defeat and failure, and as though the other person who was perpetrating abuse actually, quote unquote, won, right, in the light of what was happening. And so that was a really illuminating thing for me, that, when we come out of this lived experience and we have to walk away for our own sanity, we still take that as a sense of something is broken within us and something is not right with us. When in fact, walking away and setting your boundaries is really the thing that we're supposed to be doing as an act of self-love and self-respect. So I'm here to tell you this, when it comes to organizations, even when it comes to, dealing with the court system, dealing with, a family system, we are being failed every day because diagnosing this institutionally is not possible in the world that we live today. The response to narcissistic abuse in the workplace, in particular, presents a lack of infrastructure and a lack of perspective and frame of reference to be able to put justice in the middle of it, where the power imbalance in these relationships is actually addressed, and the person or the people who are coming forward with these experiences receive the support that they deserve, and the people who are perpetrating abuse and abuse of power and manipulation and inflicting this very awful mental health damage onto their victims receive the consequences that they deserve and don't get away with the lack of accountability. So if this is something you have been the recipient of, if this is something that you have seen somebody being the recipient of, and you have seen a lack of response and a lack of support from an institutional level, I just want to say this, which is really important. You are a decent human for raising this up. Your intuition is right on for recognizing that something is not right. You're not too sensitive, which is another thing that we get told when we decide to speak up about what we're going through. And your experience is valid. What you are going through and what that looks like to you and how that is affecting you and making you feel, nobody can take away from you. So you're not crazy. And all these things have a construct. And I hope that some of the things I'm going to share will help put it together from an awareness standpoint. In March of 2020, when we were all starting to, live our lives inside a house because of COVID and whatnot, I was in the process of writing my dissertation. I started organizing all of my resources because I decided I was going to use the lockdown to knock this out of my schedule and be able to graduate on time, regardless of the circumstances we were going through. So I took off to study what I now consider another epidemic, which is this issue of narcissistic abuse and dealing with narcissists and toxic environments and all this kind of stuff, which back then was not even a conversation, let alone 10 years ago when I started, this sort of healing journey for myself. And I came to LinkedIn and I said, hey, so I have this idea. I'm going to be touching on this topic. I'm going to be doing some research. Do you think it's a topic worth talking about? Do you think it's something that will make a difference? And I got a ton of responses validating that it was a topic that was needed to be discussed, which gave me some comfort and at the same time some curiosity as to why this was not a topic already, right, to be talked about, especially as it affects the workplace. And then I also started to recognize, and maybe this is because we were on lockdown and, Facebook and Instagram and all this social media began to be our place of gathering. But the social media discourse around this topic also took off at that time from what I was exposed to. And I started to see then another conversation emerging, right, in terms of narcissism and, everybody that was experiencing it. And there were, and there are now, gazillion social media groups in which these topics are being talked about in providing support for others out in the open. But there were comments like this, for example, why do employers keep them around when they create so much drama, gossip, and backstabbing? People talking about the predatory nature of these people and these environments. They are predatory. They look for good-hearted people. Many of us raised in trauma feel sorry for them, so we try to change them and take care of them. All the narcs I've met at work. When you do your shadow work, then you no longer share energy frequency with them. So there was this whole idea of, do we attract them, right? Is it me that has something wrong that becomes a magnet for these people? And I just want to say that is a complete lie. We don't attract them. It's just a systemic issue that we get to be a part of in society, because like there are good sides of humanity, we also have glitches of humanity that come out of our social expectations, our upbringing, the way in which our generations had passed on from generation to generation, what is called generational trauma. There's so many things underneath why we encounter these situations and why we encounter these individuals. And it's very, very widespread. So it's very common that we get to be a part of and see it on a day-to-day life that has nothing to do with us, that has nothing to do with us having something broken, or that we are attracting them into our lives. So this is just to depict that my research was a serious research. I took about a year to document a lot of information. I called it a hidden virus, looking for evidence of narcissistic abuse in the workplace, because it's one of the organizational dysfunctions that exist, that is written on the wall, but that there's zero evidence to talk about. There's no language. There's no ability to report it in a factual way. And I feel like not being able to put a finger on what it was and how to discuss it created, many dysfunctions in a especially as we work in complex and matrix and cross-functional organizations where all these issues get diluted, and there's so much little corners in which you can experience it without being able to show it at plain sight. And it's very underlying, and it creates a lot of complicated procedures to be able to deal with it. And there are many possible factors contributing to this problem, including debilitating psychological effects, because it does affect the brain, it does affect our mental health in ways that sometimes take us into a therapy room. Sometimes it makes us request for leaves of absence. But the social acceptance of this dynamic, because again, we have been told and taught that being a leader entitles you to have these behaviors with no consequences. We think it's normal and we think it's acceptable, and we think the only option is to either, put through it or walk away. Unless you learn to love yourself, to respect yourself, to understand the role of boundaries, and where your integrity actually plays into this. And we have an issue in that our reward systems within organizations may not be rewarding the right behaviors. And so it's just easy to put abuse and put mistreatment aside as a liability, as an issue, as opposed to the other way around, which is the more we can address it and the more we can talk about it and the more we can support each other in avoiding or protecting the environment from these to inflict it, which could be the normal, the sensible thing to do, then we just let it happen and we just let it run wild in organizations. So I took the experiences of people that I interviewed formally, and then I took their stories, I extracted the data, and then I used different frameworks to be able to organize the information and be able to put it in ways that hopefully could inform the phenomenon a little better. Why do I care about this? And why do I talk about it? And why do I use the terminology? Because I have seen now so many people whose lives has gone destroyed by this issue. Their reputation, their character, their paycheck, their careers that they have worked for, immensely has been taken away from them simply because they happen to be in this environment. They happen to be in contact with this type of narcissistic abusers, or any other in that category of cluster B personality disorders. And instead of being able to deal with it appropriately, receive the support that they needed, they have to take the responsibility with them and the effect of having their lives and their careers really shattered because they couldn't push through with the information or the facts or the infrastructure that was needed for them to be able to protect their well-being. And I think that's wrong. And I think nobody deserves that. And up until the point in which I wrote my dissertation, there was not a lot of these out there. So I felt like I had a responsibility from an organization development perspective, from an academic perspective, from a transformation leader perspective, to put something, right, that could help us inform employees, right? Give them some information that could help them discover, confirm, understand the patterns, and not be so vulnerable at the expense of not understanding what they're dealing with. I saw a huge significance for us as leaders, the healthy leaders, the leaders that want to come into organizations and do the right thing and come from a place of integrity and ethics and really caring for the well-being, not only of themselves and their careers, but the well-being of the multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem that they represent, and that they could be a factor in which, right, this could be dealt with, and they could be a force for good as well. And I saw a significance for organizations within companies like or human resources, ethics and compliance, all those organizations that are supposed to be there to provide the infrastructure of the right thing to do, right? Which I also saw and understood to be not very well equipped to understand this issue for what it is, and therefore not being able to provide the support and the capabilities that were needed, and sometimes being enablers of the issue itself. So for me, this was a huge, realization as to why this was important for me to document and talk about it. There are some statistics. Some of them are a little, confusing, because really collecting data to determine, right, how many narcissists are in the world, and how do we, talk about these from a mental health perspective. It's very complicated, because to begin with, the data that's out there is documented from a clinical standpoint from people who actually have been diagnosed clinically with narcissistic personality disorder, which requires somebody with narcissistic personality disorder going into a doctor's office, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, taking a test, and and then being able to collect that data, report that data, submit a diagnosis. And how many people with narcissistic personality disorder will do that when, to begin with, they don't have the awareness, or they don't have the integrity and the self-awareness to walk into a room to say, I'm hurting a lot of people, I am hurting myself, and I need help. This is not something that comes natural for them. And so what is out there, it's confusing, but some of the numbers that I included in my study come from clinical data, which I thought was probably the most reliable to go with. And it says that at least 7% of the population, whether they're clinically diagnosed or not, are narcissistic personalities that are out there in the world. This means about 60 million people who are out there blatantly taking advantage of others, abusing others, showing narcissistic behaviors. A lot of them concentrated in roles and organizations that feed their need for attention, feed their need for grandiosity, feed their need for entitlement. And obviously they have the sophisticated ways to navigate those systems and put themselves in positions where they can actually have power and status. And as they know, they can get away with so much because our infrastructures are not in place to support people who receive the abuse. They succeed at that. And so we are finding them there. But the problem is this, right? Like what I was saying, a lot of other individuals are going undiagnosed. And a lot of these also is on a spectrum, right? You don't have to be a fully narcissistic personality disordered person, but you may have traits of narcissism. You may have traits of Machiavellianism. You may have traits of sadism. There's a whole triad of behaviors that may make somebody be manipulative and make somebody be not self-aware and create all these psychological underpinnings that cause a lot of damage on others. So it's a really important statistic to keep in mind. Some other, researchers like Ben Bonche, she plainly say narcissistic abuse is an under-recognized public health issue because describing what you cannot see improve presents a huge challenge. And narcissists can easily present themselves as loving guardians and partners and leaders. So we're dealing with an invisible virus. So what did the victims of these phenomenon said for my study? I'm going to try to summarize this one here because one of the takeaways from their testimony to me was, Lindsay, nobody teaches you these things. You only know that you're dealing with something like this once it happens to you. And this was incredibly impactful for me because it took me back to the days when I was sitting in a therapy room with my therapist, totally lost and confused as to what I was dealing with, when she told me, Lindsay, you have lost your voice, you have lost your identity, you are a shell of a human being. And I went out that room, I went to Google back in the day when we didn't have ChatGPT, and I started Googling the behaviors and what does it mean not to have a voice? What does it mean to be a shell of a human? Why did I lose my ability to connect with myself? And one Google search after the other took me to understand all of this. And the moment I realized there is a thing such a narcissist, and there is a thing such a narcissistic abuse, and all these concepts and ideas came in all these Google search and YouTube videos and whatnot that I was watching. It was both relieving, knowing that I was not dealing with something invisible and that I was not making it up in my mind. But it was also terrifying because what do you do with that? How do you recognize that you are actually part of a statistic, right? That you have been psychologically abused, that you have been taken advantage of by people that you thought were good and that you were supposed to cherish. And so it was interesting that even, 12 years down the road and even today, there's still this idea that nobody's teaching you this, that there's no information. There is a lot of trivializing of the idea of narcissism, right? A lot of people make fun of it. Some people say there's not that many of them. Some people say narcissism is about taking selfies and putting on social media. And that is really dangerous because we are taking a very serious issue, trivializing it, removing the the issue in itself, right, and putting attention into what delegitimize that people are actually suffering because of this. That is dangerous. That is that leaves long-lasting traumatic effects on people, that we don't talk about that normally. The other thing that I can highlight from my research is the coping ability of the victims. So the people that I got to interview had a particular characteristics. I have to recruit people with certain previous experiences and certain requirements to be able to be a part of my study, for my study to be considered at a doctoral level. And all of them have an awareness, right, of what this was and what they went through. And one of the things that was really interesting is that their ability to cope and come out of the experience to the other side had to do with the fact that they have dealt with it in other settings before. They either grew up in a narcissistic family, which obviously, if you walk away from a narcissistic family, you are the black sheep, you are the troublemaker, you are the person who is to blame. But when in reality, you're the healthy person and you're the one trying to find a different way of living your life. They either had a marriage that broke down and they also have to learn these things early on. And then that kind of gave them a frame of reference when they have to experience it in the workplace. And now when they were in these dynamics, they knew it was familiar. They knew they were dealing with something bigger than just a typical, workplace related challenge. The other thing was the sense of closure, which we never get. And it's a big topic when you are when you have experienced this type of abuse, and something that gets us kind of stuck in the wheels of trying to heal from it, because one of the things that it leaves you with is a huge lack of closure, is a number of questions with no answers, a huge misunderstanding of, why me, and why did I get to experience that you never really genuinely find an answer for, and a way to reconcile. And this was also true for the victims that I interviewed. But there was this sense of relief of being out and being free and not having to deal with that again. Although they did have the long-lasting effects of years and years of recovery, even to the point of when we were having our conversations and I was asking them questions, there was a re-traumatizing part of it that we have to be very careful with, because those are wounds that never close. One of the hashtags of the World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day, the organization that hosts that, is "If My Wounds Were Visible." Because when you are somebody who is victim of physical abuse, which is as terrible, right? There is the bruises, there is the physical damage that happens to you. But when you're a victim of this type of invisible abuse, there are no wounds. Nobody sees what is happening. You have no way to prove it physically. You have no way to prove it even with words. And when you don't have the language, when you don't have the knowledge, when you don't have the tools, it makes you extremely vulnerable. And that is a really big experience to reconcile and come out stronger on the other side. Paul, I see your comments flipping through. I'm going to go through it in a minute and pick some of those to have a conversation as well. And I see some questions too, like this one, for example. Lindsay, wouldn't you say, though, that there are narcissists to some degree? So there is a spectrum. What you will get to yeah, I have a little bit of that here, but if you look at the literature and the other, the clinical psychologists that actually, study this, there is a big spectrum of behaviors. It's called cluster B personalities. We hear a lot about narcissism, but there is a combination of behaviors as well that could become even more dangerous when we talk about psychopathic behavior and things that are super, super more extreme. And then there's the spectrum of traits, right, that some people may display without necessarily being a disordered individual, without necessarily being a pathology. But the behaviors in themselves, if we lack self-awareness, if we are not committing to understand that we may be displaying these behaviors, cause the same damage on other people. And so that's why education and being able to have these conversations is super important, not only for those who are experiencing it, but even for ourselves to recognize, oh my gosh, I used to do this. I used to say these things. I used to bystand when these things used to happen in front of me because I thought they were normal. I thought that's how we were supposed to deal with each other. But it's all a part of a big spectrum and a big cluster of psychological underpinnings there. Thank you for the question. So there is a part of this conversation that's very important because we throw the word toxic out there in ways that sometimes makes me question if we actually know what we mean by toxic. And for the purpose of narcissistic abuse in the workplace, I personally think it contributes to our ability to not address it, to trivialize it when we just throw out there and say, this was a toxic person or this is a toxic workplace. So I have a few points of reflection here that I included in my research, which are more conversation openers than anything else, but I think it's worth, walking through together today. For me, talking about a toxic workplace as a standalone terminology leaves out the actual pathology of abuse that underpins what it means to be in a toxic environment. It leaves alone the idea of the trauma that it creates, leaves out the idea of perpetrators doing not really good things onto people who don't deserve it. And when we put everything into this toxic idea, is like a smoky mirror, right? That does not allow us to go deeper in the conversation to address the actual issue. So I personally wrestle with that idea. As I was telling Paul, to answer your question, the abuse only comes from people who have a pathology of one sort, right? Whether it is in the spectrum, whether it is fully somebody that, psychologically is, disabled and has lack of empathy inherently for other humans. And when we don't discuss the pathology, then we don't discuss the abuse, and then we allow the abuse to continue to be inflicted. Because once the abuse becomes systemic, it translates into institutional abuse and institutional betrayal, and then it kind of overblows right in our faces with a very big, very complicated phenomenon to be handled. The other piece for me is that disconnecting narcissistic abuse for the phenomenon that it is from misuse of power allows narcissists or narcissistic traits in leadership roles to continue to go glorified and rewarded, right? When we are in organizations and something happened and this person with a leadership role who also has these traits and displays these traits does something to the detriment of their team or to the detriment of somebody in a powerless position, and that person gets away with it, and that person continues to be acclaimed as the magnificent leader that the person pretends to be, then we have a big issue, because as that person gets away with it, a bunch of other people do the same, because all we do is we copy, right? What is rewarded and what's not rewarded in organizations. The other thing is that toxicity is not an adequate parameter, especially when it comes to institutional betrayal. When you go into a more challenging situation, having to report abuse, having to talk about the layers, right, of how the abuse got displayed, and then you get into documentation and all this really, complicated procedures to navigate. You cannot throw out into the documentation the word toxic. What does that mean, right? What is that? What did that do for the victim? How was that displayed by the perpetrator of the abuse? And so the layers leave the victims betrayed by the same institutions that are supposed to support them navigate and come to the other side of this in a successful way, and in a way where it doesn't affect their own livelihoods. And then the other piece of this is the whole thing about psychological safety, which has become the buzzword and the go-to, lip service intervention in most organizations, which is a good idea, which is a fabulous framework. But what happens for psychological safety to genuinely exist? We need to have people with capacity for empathy enabling those environments. Narcissists, the signature, one of the signature traits of a narcissist, or people within these cluster B personalities, is their incapacity for empathy. They see people as objects. They see their environment as a means to an end. And so what happened, we create these environments for psychological safety led by people who have no capacity for empathy, led by people who are intrinsically designed to perpetrate. And then we have other people trusting those environments, becoming extremely vulnerable, sharing things that put them right on the losing side of this. And then that's a recipe for disaster. And so I think we need to look at this with a grain of salt and be able to take a step back and say, who are we trusting to create psychological safety in their workplaces? And is it really working? And if it's not working, why is it not working? And dive deeper into that. This is a lot of documentation. I'm only going to highlight from here that companies, just like people, can display cultural disorders that stem from the amount of behaviors that are displayed in the organization. When we see organizations that demonstrate high levels of arrogance and self-absorption, when we see an inherent lack of empathy in the procedures, in the way in which we interact with each other, when we look at a lapse of ethical behaviors, right? When we see a tension between integrity and ethics, and when we recognize an unhealthy sense of entitlement and the way to use power to get what we want to the detriment of other people. Those are typical signs of either narcissistic people or narcissistic environments that we need to keep an eye on. And I would say that narcissistic behavior in the spectrum also shows in very different ways. And so learning what these behaviors look like, because we are just used to knowing the grandiose narcissist, the person that comes in and is all flashy and has a big sense of ego and all those things, but that's not necessarily true all the time. And so it could happen overtly, it could happen behind doors, it could be somebody who plays like a victim all the time, it could be somebody that is parasitic, that only wants to take advantage of other people to get ahead. So we need to learn the complexity, and we need to learn that there are some abstracts that are important parts of the equation and the puzzle that we need to learn about in order to protect ourselves and in order to support other people navigate through this. I'm going to bring up this comment. I cannot see your name, LinkedIn user, but I think it's a very important comment. But Lindsay, isn't it like all other frameworks that we give to leaders, they just use the word psychological safety in the name of safety? They gather information and perpetrate on the individual and increase toxicity. Ultimately, it's self-preservation. Seems like an answer at this stage of increased epidemic narcissism. I agree with you. I feel like it is, we are creating very, very good frameworks that are not being used by the right people. And because they are not being used by the right people, they create bigger circumstances, because now they add to their ability to have power over information, power over the vulnerability of others. But we're not necessarily looking at it from that perspective yet when we institute these ideas in our organizations. Great comment. More to the spectrum. This is a slide deck that I have made available, and I'll share again in the comments if you're interested in digging deeper into it. But back to the conversation of, is it one thing or another, or does it come in different forms? So everything here is a cycle, is a spectrum, happens mostly behind the scenes, and we need to learn the different parts in which this manifests. It could be verbal abuse, it could be manipulation, it could be emotional blackmailing, it could be gaslighting, another big word out there. It could be sabotage, neglect, withholding, workplace violence, even financial abuse. So we need to learn that all these little pieces is what makes this a phenomenon, because they happen in clusters and they happen at very specific points in time to debilitate the person on the recipient end of the abuse and to neutralize the ability for others to recognize that abuse is taking place. So as organizations become further entrenched in society, their inherent view of individuals becomes more widely accepted, that of dehumanization, self-interest, and lack of empathy. This is a shift in the sentiment that is seen in industrialized cultures and has increased over time. This is a quote from one of the authors that I researched that I found so true in the world that we live in today. We have become desensitized when it comes to dehumanizing, language. We have become accustomed that self-interest in all of its forms is a goal. We have accepted that lack of empathy, right, is acceptable and is something that we just have to deal with, and we have normalized that, and because of that, we don't have the conversations and we don't challenge that this might not be a good thing and that this might not actually be normal. There are a few other pieces to consider here, because all of these narcissistic dynamics are textbook. There are roles that people play in the organization. There are, for example, enablers that we hear a lot about, people that cozy up and people that know because that person gets away with abuse and gets away with those behaviors, they might as well plug in with them and benefit from getting away from that. There is the golden child, which is a typical role in a family system of narcissists that also play into organization, which is the person that brings the money, the person that quote unquote demonstrates the value that they bring to the organization. And then there's the scapegoat, which typically is the person that receives the abuse and speaks up and ends up paying the consequences of it. And then there's a cycle in which this abuse happens, which is the same cycle that may happen in a family or in another institution, which is they first idealize you, they charm you, they make you feel like, they are the most trusted person you could even find and that they're going to be there for you until they find what they need from you or until you become their threat. And then they start devaluing you. They start making you confused. They start making you feel like you are inadequate and kind of putting things in your mind to invalidate you, and then they discard you, which could be you decide to leave because you cannot take the pressure anymore, or they've actively kill your character, create smear campaigns, and put you in a bad light in the eyes of others. So these are things that happen systemically as a textbook, that once you start to learn the patterns and you walk in an environment and you see it, you cannot unsee it, like a lot of people say when you come to this realization. Another key finding of my study is that the abuse that these victims reported as part of the data collection kind of came from this idea that it was always inflicted from the top. And when I say the top, is not necessarily the top of the hierarchy, is somebody with more power than other. Okay. People who lie their way into either leadership roles or to cozy up with those leaders, people that had acquired institutional power within the organization. Their response varied across the organizational layers as well. So if somebody was in the middle of this issue and they wanted to go internally and find support and find ways to navigate it, they would either go to HR or ethics, or they would find support peer to peer. But more likely and more often than not, the support always came from the outside. So there was not necessarily a place to go to be able to say, hey, I'm dealing with this, and there were mechanisms to support that. They have to figure out, right, how to randomly find the one person that would listen and the one person that would believe them and give them some perspective. And then the tactical enabling practices in an organization happen almost unnoticeable, right? The abuse can happen in a one-to-one meeting. The abuse can come from a simpler request to complete a task. It could happen through a project assignment. It could be a simple phone call. It could be walking in the elevator with somebody. It could be working on presentation materials where somebody put all the intellectual property into the materials and somebody took the ideas and walk away with the work. So it was very subtle ways to in which the abuse manifests until they were the big blowout circumstances as well. But it happens in such a diluted way and it propagates in such an invisible way that it's sometimes invisible to the eye. The way in which this happens, like we were talking about, is, how it goes under the radar, right? Not everybody sees it. Not everybody who sees it does something about it. And those who see it and receive it and want to do something about it receive very penalizing consequences. It's always written on the wall. Sometimes people know it's there. It's the famous elephant in the room. And then the fast pace of a work environment also gets in the way, right, of paying attention as to whether or not this is happening. So it makes it very difficult to be spotted and to put into logical words, into logical frames of reference, which it's a huge disabling mechanism for people who are trying to deal with it. And then there's the clinical part. There is the health part of this, where it's the victims walking away with long-lasting mental health issues, because it is abuse at the end, right? It's a form of trauma. People who have experienced that severely or in parts of life, never forget it again. That gets stored into your body. That gets stored into your way of looking at the world from there. And, the participants that reported some of those symptoms always talked about feeling unease, unsure what's happening, feeling trapped, sick to their stomach, betrayed, invalidated, shameful. Some people said, I feel dirty after this experience. Heart racing, sweaty palms. Like, there is a lot of very, very, very tangible issues that we get to live with for the rest of our lives just by the fact that we were a part of these entrenched dynamics. There's a work of Dr. Nat Pangi Thomas, who put a framework, a clinical framework of what these symptoms look like. And he talked about physical symptoms. He talked about cognitive difficulties. He talked about behavioral issues, emotional problems. The ones that I highlighted there in blue are the ones that mostly showed through the data that I collected, but they're also very overlapping. So it's a big thing to carry with you. Once you, even after you walk away, you continue to deal with it for years and years and years to come. There are warning signs, like I started to mention with the frameworks that we just saw. Obviously, the ability to detach from the abuse and endure it was something that the participants were very outspoken about, and that had a direct dependency on their emotional health. So the people that I interviewed, since they had already dealt with it, they have done a lot of therapy, a lot of personal work. So their emotional health was probably at a higher standard than somebody who's never done that work, who's just coming into for the first time. And that gave them a little bit of an advantage, right, in walking out of these situations. Childhood histories, how they grew up, having had that frame of reference gave them an advantage to be able to deal with this and get out of it, safely. Being equipped with, a meaningful career, an academic, career as well. But with the struggle that they still have default triggers, in that they recognize they were people pleasers, and that in trying to protect their careers, they seek to please the abuser until they figured out that was insane to do. And so there's this whole thing about Stockholm syndrome, which is another topic for another day. But it happens when you are in these abusive relationships. Your instinct is to figure out how to make it work. And your instinct is to try to understand why the other person behaves the way that other person behaves. And that puts you in the cycle of people pleasing that is not necessarily where we need to be. So a few significant findings here as a summary as well to keep an eye on. The objective of narcissistic abuse is to maintain power, control, and status, right? That is the end for the narcissist, for the people with this type of personalities, to stick through an abusive way to approach life. That is, they do that in the workplace, they do that at home, they do that with their friends. Is their way they have been wired based on their own trauma, based on their own upbringing, to navigate the world. Is something that is programmed within themselves, and all they care about is power, control, and status. And that's why narcissistic abuse is the way in which they inflict that and they pursue that. Fear and distrust is the petri dish for this. That is how they win, right? When they create an environment that is driven by fear, that is driven by insecurities, that is driven by invalidation. These are the tactics. This is a huge sign that we might or might not be in an environment, where we walk on eggshells and things like that. That's something to pay attention to. The abuse is propagated through the team dynamics and the cultural ideology. That is, it becomes a fabric of the organization. It becomes the way in which we treat each other. It becomes the proxy, right? Because they need to protect themselves from being exposed. And so that they know how to manipulate the environment to their benefit. It's a systemic cycle, like we just discussed. It compromises our ability to feel like we belong in the organization, because one of the things that this does is to create the illusion, protect the facade an organization may have of pretense, right? That we are these kind of organizations versus the organization that people experience from within. And so creating this separation then disable the conversation and disable people flagging, right? The warning signs. So I'm just one person. And obviously, I'm not a famous person. I don't have a big platform, but I have this work. And in the words of Maya Angelou, I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. And I feel like, when you have information, when you are going through experiences that could then become a platform for other people to learn from, it is our responsibility to share that information. For me, it's really important that we continue to lean into this idea of validating our human experience. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be advocated for. Is the least we can do as leaders in organizations, inside or out. And I want to recognize the courage of people who come forward with the stories, because it's not easy to come and sit down and say, I went through this, and be told that what you went through is not what you went through, and that you are crazy, and that you're making stuff up, and that you're being dramatic and sensitive, and all these awful labels that are thrown out there for people without knowing the courage that it takes to speak up about these things. And so I want to make sure, people who are going through this know that there are others of us out there just really bringing the light to this issue, shedding light into what's going on here, and that their stories are not going lost. That their courage in talking about this type of abuse in the workplace in particular should be a force multiplier, and it needs to be an inspiration as opposed to a hindering for those who actually have the institutional power to make changes, for those who actually create the infrastructures, right, that's supposed to protect safety and morals and ethics in organizations. And I hope that, as people grow out of these post-traumatic issues and experiences, that we find the personal strength to face it head on, to talk about it openly, that we use it as the means to continue to find each other, to support each other, to build relationships that help us understand what interacting healthy with each other actually looks like. It is an spiritual, it is an existential change. This changes you forever. And there's no way to look back to prioritizing what's truly important in life. But it also brings new possibilities. And I think, like in any other phenomenon, in any other systemic issue, we have new possibilities to find strength and to find meaningful conversation and meaningful ways to create a different narrative and to create a different way to engage with each other. So this is my way to appreciate life and to put just a little bit of what I've gone through and what I've studied in the hands of others that can amplify it as well. So I'm going to skip through this, and because we already are going a little bit over time, there are a couple of comments here. I'm going to read quickly just for the sake of keeping it all within this LinkedIn Live and their recording. Paul, let me see here. What's wild to me is that hustle culture is rooted in narcissism. And before COVID, this is how most businesses and leaders operated. Yeah, it is true. And we made hustle culture a badge of honor. The more we hustle, the more we are stressful, the more we high achieve, the more we stick through the race. The more some of them win, the ones that are equipped to sophisticatedly trample upon other people, and the more the people who recognize this was not a way of living and this is not healthy started to take a step aside and think for themselves, like, what is life supposed to look like? And are we supposed to be hustling all the time and feeling broken all the time? And, we were able, and we continue to be able to make different choices. Let me see what else I have here. Thank you, Melissa, for joining, and Hannah. I was trying to go through the materials and I had the comments kind of circulating without paying too much attention to it. I'm not sure if desensitization, as much as it is being overwhelmed with information and stimulation of literally having the world at our fingertips, self-awareness is the root of the issue. I believe most of the people aren't aware of what they say or do. There is, from my perspective, both desensitization and lack of self-awareness are sides of the same coin, because when we talk about self-awareness, on the side of people with these kind of cluster B personality disorders, that's one of the things they never developed in their human development process, right? They don't have the capacity to. They develop a coping mechanism that protects them by creating an imaginary story of who they are in the world. And they stuck with that. And it's so entrenched in their ego that that's all they know. That's all the lens they have to see the world, how important they are, how other people are there to service them. And that lack of self-awareness on their side inhibits them from seeking help and from healing and from becoming people who are actually functional adults in society. And then there's the self-awareness on the victim side, which typically comes from people who have a level of self-awareness or have the capacity to develop self-awareness because they're naturally empathetic, because that's how they also learn how to cope with the world. And the frame of reference of the self-awareness may not be there at the beginning of the abusive relationship. They may just not know. And it is through this development that they heighten their self-awareness. They learn more about themselves. They reclaim their identity. They reclaim their worth, right? And then things begin to come back into place for those individuals. And they're the people who get stuck in those relationships and never get out, because of lack of self-awareness and because of lack of understanding. So those are the long-lasting, quote unquote, toxic relationships that have no end. So yes, it's a big part of it. But there's also the desensitization at a society level. There, we have become a little too invalidating. When somebody comes and shares, I went through these and I have my boss who did that and I have my coworker who's stealing my ideas, and people come and say, well, if somebody steals your ideas, you should take that as a compliment, right? That is a desensitization tactic that we just learned and we got accustomed of. And therefore, in something as simple as that, something you put a lot of work into that another person just took from you and made it their own with no effort of their own, we think that's normal. And we think that, we just got to take it because it's a compliment. There's a lot of dissonance that has made us very desensitized as to how these things happen in plain sight and what we are willing to accept versus where we set a boundary and we say, this is actually wrong and I'm not going to participate in this, which takes a lot of time and effort and being able to stick with the circumstance and be able to be an instrument of change in the interactions that we can be. So that's what I wanted to bring to you today. I hope there was something in here that you can take away and potentially help another person, hopefully helpful for you, maybe something informative. At the end of the day, we need to keep having every another conversation that can help us continue to create the environments that we want to be in and be the leaders that we want to be and put the teams together that can grow and become other ripple effects of goodness in the world. And it is understanding a lot of these very difficult topics that we're going to get there, in my opinion. So I'm glad that you made it. If you get to the recording, I'm glad that you listened. If you have any questions, DM me. I'm always available to talk about these things and to support in any way that I can. And I hope to see you in the next LinkedIn Live for my new series, Human as Usual. And I appreciate your support and being there for me through this long journey that I put myself through last year. So happy Saturday. I hope everybody have very good plans, and I'll see you all soon.